Some debts aren't paid in money. Some are paid in people. Tessa Wynn learned that on a Wednesday in November, the kind of grey, bone-cold Wednesday that made you feel like the world had always been this colour and always would be. She was sitting at the kitchen table of her uncle's house. Not her home, it had never been her home, just the place she ate and slept and tried not to take up too much space. Going through the grocery receipts the way she did every week, cross-referencing them against the household account because no one else bothered to, when she heard the voices in the other room drop to a register she didn't recognize. Low. Careful. The kind of voices that meant a decision had already been made. She didn't move. She had learned early that moving, walking in, asking questions, existing in doorframes, was a kind of invitation for problems, so she sat very still with her pencil in her hand and the column of numbers blurring in front of her, and she listened. Her Uncle Harvey had a debt. That part wasn't news. Harvey had always had debts the way other men had hobbies, casually, consistently, without apparent shame. What was news, what turned the kitchen cold in a way that had nothing to do with November, was the name she heard next, Morrow. She knew the name the way you knew the names of weather systems. Not personally, not up close. You just knew when something was coming. The arrangement, as Harvey explained it to her 40 minutes later, with the television on in the background and a beer he wasn't drinking sweating in his hand, was simple. That was the word he used. Simple. He said it the way people said words when they were hoping the word would do the work of the explanation. "You're good with numbers," he said. "That's all this is. They need someone who's good with numbers." Tessa looked at him. She was 26 years old, and she had been living in Harvey's house since she was 17, since her mother died, and her mother's second husband made it clear within a week that he didn't consider Tessa part of the inventory he'd married into. She had learned to read Harvey the way you learned to read a road in bad weather, watching for what wasn't visible yet, the ice under the slick. "How much?" she said. He told her. She put the pencil down. It wasn't the number that bothered her, it was the way he said it, with relief, like the number was the end of the story instead of the middle of it. Like she was a line item that balanced the sheet. "And if I don't go," she said. Harvey looked at the television. A man on screen was laughing at something. "They'd come here," he said, "and they wouldn't be looking for an accountant." She picked the pencil back up, not because she'd agreed, just because she needed something to hold. Came Thursday morning before the light was fully up, black, clean in a way that looked deliberate. The man who got out wasn't large or loud or visibly armed, which somehow made him more frightening than all three would have. He handed her an envelope without looking at her face and walked back around to the driver's side. Harvey stood in the doorway. He didn't wait. Tessa got in the car. She had one bag. She'd packed it the night before, sitting on the edge of her bed in the room that had never fully felt like hers, going through what she owned with the same methodical neutrality she brought to balance sheets. Practical clothes. Her calculator, the old one with the crack in the casing that she'd had since community college. Her mother's watch, the small gold one that didn't keep perfect time anymore, but kept it close enough. A paperback she'd already read twice. She did not bring anything Harvey had given her, because Harvey hadn't given her anything. The city slid past the windows. Then the city thinned out. Then there was nothing for a while but interstate, and the grey beginning of sky. The compound, if that was the right word for it, and it wasn't, but Tessa's mind needed to call it something, sat behind iron gates on the northern edge of a county she'd driven through once and not looked at twice. The house itself was large in the way that money that doesn't need to announce itself is large, proportional, understated, everything built to last. A woman named Soren met her at the door. She was maybe 50, had the brisk economy of movement of someone who'd organized armies in previous careers, and she showed Tessa to a room on the second floor with the efficiency of a person who had shown other people to other rooms many times and did not consider it interesting work. "You'll start in the morning," Soren said. "Breakfast is at 7. Don't be late." "What exactly am I starting?" Tessa asked. Soren paused at the door. She looked at Tessa the way you looked at a question you hadn't expected. Mr. Cale will explain your scope. Mr. Cale, Tessa repeated. Yes. Tessa had assumed Morrow. She filed the correction away without showing it. She didn't sleep well. She'd expected not to. The room was clean and quiet, and the bed was the best she'd slept in years, which was its own particular kind of disorienting. She lay on her back and looked at the ceiling and ran numbers in her head the way some people prayed. Not because the numbers solved anything, but because the structure of them was familiar, and familiar was the only comfort available. In the morning, she went downstairs at 5 to 7 and found coffee already made and a folder on the kitchen table. She was opening it when she heard the footsteps. She'd expected someone who looked like what she imagined when she thought of the word dangerous. She didn't know exactly what that was, but she'd had a vague picture. Loud, broad, the kind of man who needed the room to know he was in it. Cale was not that. He was tall, dressed plainly, with the kind of economy of movement that suggested he'd spent a long time learning not to waste any part of himself. He had a scar along his left jaw, not dramatic, just present, a seam where something had been repaired. His eyes, when they landed on her, were the color of slate and had approximately the warmth of it. He looked at the folder open in front of her. "You're early," he said. "The folder was there," she said. "I assumed it was meant to be read." Something shifted in his face, more like the edge of one. "What?" he said. He poured coffee, not offering her any, just pouring his own, which she noted, and sat down across from her. Mostly shell structures. Someone has been moving money in increments small enough to stay under automated flags. I need to know how much, from where, and to where. And I need to know who built the system. Tessa looked at the pages. She could already see the architecture of it just from the column headers. Someone methodical. Someone who understood how auditors thought and worked slightly to the left of how they looked. "How long do I have?" she said. "How long do you need?" "That depends on how much access I have." He studied her for a long moment, not the way men sometimes, not appraising in that way, more like he was running a calculation, finding her place in the ledger. "What you need," he said finally, "within reason." Define reason, the edge of a reaction again. "You'll know when you reach it." She looked back at the pages. "Give me 3 days for the overview, another week for the full map." He stood, picked up his coffee. "You have 2 days for the overview." He left. Tessa looked at the folder. She put her finger on the first column header and started. She did not see much of Cale in those first days. The compound. She kept using the word, even though it wasn't right, operated with a quietness that felt enforced, rather than natural. People moved through the halls on their business and didn't linger. Soren materialized with meals and information and disappeared again. A man named Oleander, young and watchful, was assigned to be nearby without being described as her guard, which was how she knew he was her guard. She worked. That she could do. The 37 accounts were, as she'd suspected, a carefully constructed maze, not obvious enough to catch a non-specialist's attention, but too internally consistent to be accident. Someone had built this with patience, someone who thought in the same lateral way she did, only they'd used it to take instead of account. On the second day, she found the first signature, not a name, but a habit. The way the internal transfers were timed, 12-minute intervals, consistent across 7 months. Nobody timed transfers by accident at 12-minute intervals. She wrote it down and kept going. That night she was in the study they'd given her, a real study, with good light, which she hadn't expected. When Cale appeared in the doorway, he didn't knock. She suspected he didn't knock anywhere. "Progress," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "I found a timing pattern. 12-minute intervals on all inter-account transfers, going back to March." She turned the legal pad toward him. "It's a person's habit, not a program's. Programs randomize or use round numbers. This is someone who gets interrupted every 12 minutes and resumes. That tells you about their physical environment." He came to the desk and looked at the pad. He didn't touch it. "Office setting," he said. "Shared space or scheduled interruptions. Meetings. Rounds. Something regular." He was quiet. She could feel him thinking in the same way you could feel weather change. Atmospheric. Pressure-based. You found this in 2 days, he said. The pattern was there to find. I just looked for it. He looked at her then, not the calculation from the first morning. Something different, though she couldn't have named what. Most people don't look, he said. Most people aren't looking at columns all day. He straightened. Finish the map. Then we'll talk about next steps. He left again. Tessa looked at the legal pad and felt something she hadn't expected. The particular satisfaction of work that was genuinely difficult and going genuinely well. She hadn't felt that in a long time. She hadn't had work worth feeling it about. She turned back to the accounts and kept going. The week passed. She built the map. It was in the end a thing she was quietly proud of, not because it was hers, but because it was accurate, and accuracy was the closest thing to beauty she'd ever entirely trusted. 3 people, she concluded. 1 architect, 2 executors. The architect had the timing habit and a secondary signature she'd found in the structural choices, specific denominations used to make rounded sums, a small vanity, the kind of thing you stopped noticing in your own work after years. Someone senior. Someone who'd been doing this for a long time and had gotten confident. She presented it to Cale on the 7th morning, with the documentation organized by account, by timeline, and by what she called confidence level, how certain she was of each conclusion and why. He's read for 20 minutes without speaking. She drank her coffee and waited. She had learned he didn't like to be interrupted when he was thinking, and she didn't particularly like being interrupted either, so this was one of the few ways they were immediately compatible. "You're telling me the architect is internal," he said finally. "I'm telling you the patterns are consistent with someone who has routine access and has had it for years. Whether that's internal or a long-standing external contact with regular access, I can't say for certain. But the confidence level on that conclusion is high, 85%. Maybe higher. The vanity with the denominations is the kind of thing you only do when you're not worried about scrutiny from the inside." He set the papers down. He looked at her with that same calculating attention, but there was something underneath it now that hadn't been there in the first days. "You've done this before," he said. "Not this. I did forensic accounting work for a firm in the city. Insurance fraud, mostly. The signatures are different, but the logic is the same. Why did you leave?" She paused. It was the first personal question he'd asked her. She wasn't sure whether to answer honestly or efficiently, and then decided those were probably the same thing with Cale. "I was good at it," she said. "My supervisor was threatened by that. There was a man he preferred for the senior position. I chose to leave before I got managed out." Cale absorbed this. "His loss," he said. She hadn't expected that. The words were so spare and so plainly meant that she didn't have a response prepared. "The next step," she said instead, "is tracing where the extracted money ended up. That's a different kind of work. I'll need banking access specifically." "You'll have it," he said. "Whatever you need." There were things she learned about the compound in those weeks that she hadn't expected to learn. She learned that Cale ran it the way an engineer might run a system, not with charisma or fear, but with precision and a long memory. People didn't disobey him twice, not because of consequences she ever witnessed, but because it became apparent, quickly, that he simply remembered everything and factored it into how he operated. Mistakes were noted. Growth was noted. He kept a ledger in his head the same way she kept one on paper. She learned that the scar on his jaw was not the only one. There were others, more hidden, visible sometimes when he turned a certain way, or when the light was particular. She stopped noticing them as damage and started noticing them as geography, a map of what he'd survived. She learned that he ate at odd hours, that he didn't drink, that he read in the evenings in a chair near the window in the study on the first floor with the particular concentration of someone who was rarely interrupted and liked it that way. She learned this last thing because she started doing the same thing, reading in the evenings at the small table near the window, because the light was good there. They didn't speak much those evenings, but there was a quality to the silence between them that she couldn't find a column to put in. One evening he looked up from his book. "Your uncle told my contact that you had no one," he said. Tessa kept her eyes on her page for a moment. Then, He was right. No one at all. There's an aunt in Oregon I spoke to at my mother's funeral. We didn't exchange numbers. He looked at her for a moment. Then he went back to his book. 2 nights later, he said, without preamble, I had a sister. She died when I was 22. After that, there was no one who was obligated to the actual fact of me. It changes how you operate. Tessa set her book down. She looked at him across the room. Yes, she said simply. It does. He didn't explain further. She didn't ask him to. But something shifted that night. Not dramatically, not in any way that would make a good story. Just the subtle recalibration of 2 people who had recognized something in each other's accounting of the world. The internal source was a man named Carver Doone. He was 53, had been with the organization for 11 years, managed logistics routing, and had the particular quality of someone who had convinced himself that a small wrong done consistently was somehow morally different from a large one. He'd been redirecting fractions for so long he'd stopped thinking of it as stealing. Tessa found him through a combination of the denomination signature and a cross-reference she ran on scheduling records Soren dug out for her. Finding the 12-minute intervals mapped nearly perfectly onto the timing of Doone's weekly procurement calls, she brought the full documentation to Cale on a Tuesday morning. He read it, set it down. You're certain, he said, 91%. The remaining 9% accounts for the possibility of a very sophisticated setup to frame him, which is possible but would require the frame to have been in place for 7 years, and counting. Nobody frames someone for 7 years. No, she agreed. He was quiet for a moment. How much did he take? She told him the number. She'd run it 4 times to be sure. Cale didn't react visibly, but she saw the small shift at the corner of his jaw. Not anger. Exactly. The kind of thing that happened when a calculation yielded a result you'd already prepared yourself for and still found unpleasant. This will be handled, he said. She nodded. She did not ask what that meant. It was one of the places she had learned was the edge of what she needed to know. He looked at her then, and this time the calculation was so thin she could almost see through it to whatever was underneath. You could have shaved this, he said, hidden what you found, bought yourself leverage. She looked at him steadily. That's not how I keep books. He held her gaze for a moment. No, he said, I can see that. He gathered the papers, started to leave. Cale, she said. He stopped, turned. In the weeks she'd been here, she could count the number of times she'd used his name on one hand. What happens to me now? She said. I came here as a debt. I've done the work. So, what's the arrangement now? He was quiet for a moment that was neither awkward nor comfortable, just waited like the air before something changed. What do you want the arrangement to be? He said. She hadn't expected that. She thought about it honestly, the way she did everything. I want to stay, she said. I want to keep doing the work, not as a debt or a favor or a liability to be managed. As someone who's actually good at this and knows it. He looked at her for a long time. Those are acceptable terms, he said. Harvey called, eventually. She was surprised the number still worked. He called on a Thursday evening when she was in the study going through a new set of accounts. Cleaner ones, maintenance work, which she'd found she didn't mind, and she looked at his name on the screen for a long moment before she picked up. Tessa, he said. I wanted to check in, see how things were. She could hear the television in the background. Same channel, probably. Things are fine, she said. Good. A pause. You're not. You're okay. They're treating you. Harvey, she said. You sold me to pay a debt. The silence on his end was the particular quality of a man who'd hoped the subject would somehow not come up directly. I didn't have a choice, he started. You had the same number of choices you always have, she said. You made the one that was easiest for you. I'm not calling that a sin. I'm calling it what it is. Another pause. I just wanted you to know, he said, that I think about it. Tessa looked at the columns in front of her. The clean numbers. The order she'd built out of somebody else's chaos. Okay, she said. Goodbye, Harvey. She sat with it for a moment. Not anger, not grief exactly, just the flat acknowledgement of a thing that was true. He would think about it, probably, and it wouldn't change a single number in any column that mattered. She picked up her pencil and went back to work. She and Cale were not easy with each other in any of the conventional ways. They didn't talk about feelings. They didn't have evenings where things were softly resolved. What they had was a kind of parallel precision, two people who operated by the same internal logic, who'd spent so long without anyone to match it that the matching itself was startling. He showed her things, gradually. Not the parts of his life he kept locked. She never expected those, but the working parts, the architecture of what he'd built and how. He asked her questions and listened to the answers in a way that meant he was actually filing them, not just waiting for his turn to speak. He remembered things she said weeks later and referenced them without announcement, the same way she did. He brought her coffee one morning without being asked, because she'd run out and he'd noticed. She didn't say anything about it. Neither did he. But she noted it the way she noted everything. Precisely, without sentiment, with the understanding that small, accurate observations were how you built a true picture of anything. One evening she was on the first-floor terrace watching the sun go down behind the tree line when he came out and stood beside her. Not close, just present. "I want to show you something," he said. He took her to a room she hadn't been in, on the third floor at the end of the East Hall. Inside was a desk, a chair, a window that looked over the north field, and 3 walls of shelving, not decorative, working shelves covered in binders and ledgers going back, from what she could estimate, 25 years. "This is the real one," he said. "Not the reported accounts, not the shells. This is where everything actually is." She looked at it, the scope of it. 25 years of operations, laid out in material she could work with, the kind of work she'd have given her careful, cautious, underestimated self a decade ago to have access to. "Why are you showing me this?" she said. He was quiet a moment. Then, "Because I trust you with it. And I don't trust easily, and I've never trusted carelessly. So when I say I trust you, I mean I've run the numbers." She looked at him. "So have I," she said. She looked back at the shelves, at everything he'd handed her. "I'm going to need better lighting in this room," she said. And she actually heard, the sound of Cale almost smiling. There is a particular feeling, Tessa would think later, in becoming something no one thought you would be. Not for their sake, not to prove anything to Harvey, or to the supervisor who'd passed her over, or to anyone who'd ever looked at her and made quick arithmetic that didn't add up to much, just for the plain, honest satisfaction of a ledger that balanced. She knew what people called her now, in the circles where Cale's name carried weight. She knew what they said when they talked about the woman who'd found Dune, who'd rebuilt the accounts, who sat at the table now when decisions got made and had the numbers at her fingertips and didn't flinch. She didn't need them to say it differently. She'd never needed anyone to do her accounting for her. She was good at this. She had always been good at this. Now, she was exactly where that had always deserved to put her.